Probably your own. Yeah, dude. Okay, the we're talking about this idea. If I get pitched by it's like, we're talking about the 80s and. My thought was.
All righty then. Let's go. I will go over then. Everyone, page 11, let's go. All right. So, the late 70s would be the era of a conservative revival, partially because of the bad economic times, but a return to trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics. Mm-hmm. What did I say? Page 9?
No, you didn't say anything.
You said 11.
You said 11. You said 11.
I thought I did say it.
Yeah, you did say.
Okay. And it was partially fueled by resentment, backlash against the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement that was focused around anti-abortion rights, so-called pro-life. And they began to call this the culture war. As the fight, it was a fight against expanding rights for expanding civil rights and abortion rights and women's rights against those who thought that was destroying the traditional values. And that would help lead to Ronald Reagan becoming president. So the election of 1980. Conservative Republicans took over the party and nominated former governor and former actor Ronald Reagan as president, promising to make America great again. That was the slogan. And so very much conservatives go back to an idealized time before civil rights, all the disruption of civil rights, before women's rights, and promising a new economic system, which was trickle-down economics. And the Democrats nominated President Jimmy Carter, who was incredibly unpopular and blamed for the very high inflation that happened throughout the 1970s because of a couple different oil shocks. History is an interesting thing. It repeats. But also while this happened, oil was the big one, was probably that caused this election defeat. And it looked like it was going to be a very tight election at the very end. Reagan won an overwhelming victory. I think partially because of just hatred of Jimmy Carter. It really wasn't a pro-Reagan vote. But Reagan was elected. Okay, Reaganomics. Reaganomics was this. It was return to trickle-down economics, but they called it supply side economics. And that was based on this basic idea. Massive tax cuts for the very wealthy. That's Reaganomics, Reagan economic system. Massive tax cuts for the very wealthy and cutting social programs. So the safety net programs, like dramatically cutting aid for education, trying to get rid of any aid for student lunches, things like that. Dramatic cuts and a huge increase in defense spending. And Reagan promised that with massive tax cuts will so boost the economy that it'll get rid of the budget deficit. So that was the promise. It probably would not have passed. It didn't look like it was going to be very popular. Republicans controlled the Senate, Democrats still controlled the House. But then he was shot. And it was almost like, oh, we got Reagan was shot. Horribly wounded. We found out later it was really bad. And it passed. Partially because of the plucky president coming back from this, which he was plucky, no doubt about it. Did it reduce the deficit? Absolutely not. the deficit would begin to boom, and the debt would go up. Defense buildup. Reagan promised a 10% increase in defense spending because Carter promised 5%, implying that the Soviets were way ahead militarily. And so the US would begin the largest peacetime military buildup in its history up to that time. Massive increase in defense spending. And Reagan's rhetoric against the Soviet Union got to be very warlike, threatening of nuclear war, and once calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, literally right after he just saw a Star Wars movie, literally. And in 1983, because of the huge defense buildup, and actually the Soviet Union was in decline and cutting back defense spending, they were in real trouble. The Soviets were convinced that the United States was going to go to war, and they were within, we don't know if it was a day or an hour from launching a mission that the US was going to go first. I'm really glad I did not know how close we were in 1983. That would have been very depressing. But a massive increase in defense spending. Nicaragua. Nicaragua in 1980, their military dictatorship fell to a group called the Sandinistas, who were kind of socialist. Everyone got that? And Reagan started talking about sending troops to kick them out. Looked like another Vietnam. That freaked everybody out. But eventually, the United States sent aid to counter-revolutionaries called Contras, C-O-N-T-R-A, Contras, who were actually pretty brutal thugs. We'll come back to that. Next, where we at? Iran-Contra. I guess we'll. So, Congress responded by saying it was illegal to fund Contras. It was illegal to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. So what Reagan did is, in his second term illegally, was sell arms to Iran, which was against the law, and use the profits of that to give weapons to the Contras, violating something like 39 federal laws. But he somehow escaped any punishment. Almost 20 members of his cabinet would be indicted, and many would be convicted. But Reagan escaped responsibility, and in a deposition said, I don't know, or I can't recall, 139 times. We now know part of the reason is he was delegating the authority. He would work 1 or 2 hour days, but dementia had others. He was in on the others. Probably partially triggered by the assassination. He was really, they hid that in the American public. Next, where we at here? Persian Gulf, oh no, Gorbachev. After a series of fossils in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev would become the new leader of the Soviet Union in 1984, and he immediately tried to save the Soviet Union from ruin, wanted arms control to stop the arms race. And Reagan, once he realized how close the world came to nuclear war in 83, actually began negotiate. When he said he would never negotiate. Now the United States and the Soviet Union began to negotiate arms control agreements, eventually leading to a strategic arms reduction. And a lot of conservative Republicans and some conservative Democrats accused Reagan of being a traitor and a communist. Wow, the Cold War was interesting. But Gorbachev thought he was saving the Soviet Union. It did not work by opening society up. The Soviet Union collapsed quite suddenly in 1989. That's the end of the Cold War. Happened really suddenly. The Soviet Union had been in decline for 20 years, and the system just broke down. And when they allowed for more freedoms in the satellite nations, they began to break away. And the big symbol, poster I really like, right up there, November 1989. The people of East Berlin just literally kind of stormed the wall, went over the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War just ended. Soviet Union would collapsed in 1991, but the Cold War ended. That became symbolic. And I can still very vividly remember that. Still weird to me. So, the Persian Gulf War, 1990, 1991. So, Iraq attacked Kuwait and took Kuwait. They blamed Kuwait for rising oil prices. Iraq and Iran had fought a bloody, horrible war for a decade. And Iraq kind of blamed Kuwait for helping Iran, even though it's much more complex than that. And the US, for various reasons, organized a massive coalition of almost 40 countries. The United States, a coalition of almost 40 countries to push Iraq out of Iran. Out of Kuwait. And this became known as Operation Desert Storm. Yes, there's a group in the Pentagon. Their only job is to come up with names of operations. That sounds cool. Desert Storm. And in a very quick action, the United States and its allies pushed Iraq out and then stopped. They did not want to remove Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, because the realization was that if they try to remove Saddam Hussein, that would trigger a civil war and probably help Iran. And of course, what did Saddam Hussein say after that? I won. I won because I didn't get pushed out by the United States. So this is not over yet. Anti-crime bill. Now, we kind of skipped ahead. I forgot to add one more thing to the Persian Gulf War. I did not put this in there. Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, succeeded Reagan, and he was president at this time. George H.W. Bush. This is my very quick version of this. All right. Bush would be defeated for re-election by Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was a conservative Democrat. And one of the things was an anti-crime bill. In 1993, Congress passed a massive anti-crime bill that dramatically increased funding for law enforcement and dramatically increased sentences for crime. Also banned assault weapons for 10 years. But this was at a time of just the height of crime in American history, the early 1990s. And it will really increase the number of people in prison, and we're stuck with this law to this day. Oklahoma City, 1995, with the biggest domestic terrorist attack in American history. Right-wing, anti-government terrorists blew up the federal government offices in Oklahoma City, killing almost 200 people, including about 40 children at the daycare center that was the basement of it. They used a fertilizer bomb, but it's really showed the threat of right-wing terrorism, even though there had been a lot of terrorist activity in the 1970s, nothing like this, as an effort to murder people. Both involved would eventually be executed. Next, NAFTA. NAFTA, that would be, that was a treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it got rid of all tariff barriers and other barriers between Canada, US, and Mexico. It's still basically the agreement today, but the whole idea was to get rid of tariffs, and the thought is that this free trade agreement would allow for more, it was sold at more US trade in Mexico and Canada, but the exact opposite happened. This is going to trigger a massive wave of US companies setting up shop in Mexico. And this would be called globalization. It did not work as thought, so we got globalization. That is the beginning of US companies taking advantage of modern shipping and supply systems, corporations setting up their factories and moving their location to other countries. And thus, everyone had this, an increase in the trade deficit. So, for example, the United States started American car companies started building factories in Mexico. And then clothing in Mexico, and then Guatemala, then Honduras, and now it's Indonesia and Vietnam and Bangladesh.
So it's like cheaper.
It's cheaper and no environmental laws. So we don't have much environmental laws now today, still more than Bangladesh. And inequality of wealth. This started happening in the 1980s, but it became startling up to this day. A massive divide between the very top and the rest of Americans. And wages for most Americans stagnated from 1980 to 2000 and my years from 2020. Stagnated. And almost all income gains went to the top 1%. And that's going to lead to real demand problems down the road. They call it a K-shaped economy today. 1%. You see a little bit of 10%, but it's the 1%. But remember, that's the goal of supply side economics. So speaking of that, the election of 2000. So George W. Bush, governor of Texas, would run against Al Gore, Bill Clinton's vice president. Al Gore was a moderate to conservative Democrat. And the election was razor thin. And it came down to one state, Florida. Al Gore won the popular vote. But if Bush won Florida, he won the election. And immediately it was contested. It was within 200 votes. And they needed to recount. There was a bunch of problems with the ballots. And so this became, for 4 weeks, nothing but Florida at the election. Will they have a recount? What's going to happen in Florida? Eventually, it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to stop any recount and give George Bush the victory. They never did a recount. Probably Gore would have won, but we'll never know. We'll never know. So the Supreme Court gave the election to George W. Bush. That's where we get the blue state, red state, by showing that map over and over again. So, big deal. And George W. Bush's first move, massive tax cuts, supply side tax cuts at the very level. Massive. I should have, much like Reagan, much like 1921, this is going to trigger a bubble that will eventually lead to the 2008 crash. But massive tax cuts with the idea that this will stimulate such economic growth that the deficit will disappear. And the deficit was basically gone under Clinton. But what happened? Deficits went up dramatically. September 11, 2001. So this was a large, well-organized terrorist attack by a group called Al-Qaeda that the US had one time supported and gave aid to. And the leader of Al-Qaeda was a man by the name of Osama bin Laden, who was a Saudi Arabian son of a multimillionaire who the US supported against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But they hijacked 4 planes with plans to attack the United States. And let me tell you the reasons they did this attack. This was a terrorist attack, so they wanted a political action out of this. And the reason were this. Number one, US aid for Israel, especially the Israeli occupation of West Bank and Gaza, which I'm sure, as we all know, has been resolved. That's me. Next, number two, the US aid for brutal dictatorships in the Middle East. Brutal dictatorships of the United States supported, including Saudi Arabia. And why do we support them? For oil and wealth. And number three, US sanctions on Iraq after the war. That was strangling Iraq after the war, even though Al-Qaeda hated Saddam Hussein. And that was the reason they attacked. And what was the hope for response? What Osama bin Laden wanted is for the US to lose its mind. and attack the Middle East and show that they really are just brutal. The United States is brutal and will do everything to protect its wealth and oil. So they wanted the United States to attack. Now I got to be clear about this. This is psychotic, but I should add the U.S. did exactly what some of them wanted to. And we know the attacks hit two of the Twin Towers. The plane that was going to go to the White House made a 90-degree turn into the Pentagon instead, probably because of the size of the building. And then the one that was on its way to the Capitol was taken down by the people on board the plane. This is the second bloodiest day in American history after the Battle of Antietam. So what will this trigger? You can imagine how people in the United States desperately wanted revenge. And since Osama bin Laden and his tiny little group of Al-Qaeda were in Afghanistan, which was in the middle of the Civil War, the U.S. intervened in the Civil War in Afghanistan. The United States aided a group called the Northern Alliance that removed a group that had been in power for about 3 years called the Taliban, who indirectly were allied with Osama bin Laden and its complex. And that's going to trigger a 19-year war in Afghanistan. But the United States stayed and tried to build a country involved in that civil war. And eventually, a decade later, Osama bin Laden would be found and assassinated. But the U.S. is going to get stuck in a quagmire in Afghanistan. And in 2021, the U.S. would leave in defeat. Despite the bravery of the men and women who were going there from all over the world. Iraq War. Almost immediately after the invasion, George W. Bush started implying that Iraq was behind the September 11th attack, which they were not at all. Mortal enemies to Al-Qaeda. And building a nuclear weapon, a weapon of mass destruction, WMD. And in 2003, President Bush, now with a tiny few allies, for various reasons, the Brits and a few others, from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, attacked Iraq. Iraq didn't really have an army anymore after the Iraq War and the Gulf War. So it fell, Baghdad fell in about a month, but that is going to turn into a bloody, horrible quagmire. That almost 5,000 Americans are going to die, and anywhere from 500,000 to less than the size of 1 million Iraqis would die. Just an absolute bloodbath. And the United States would eventually pull out in not won almost every battle, but remember, they were a little bit like the Revolutionary War. Hurricane Katrina, a massive Category 5 hurricane, a once in 100-year hurricane that now's every year. Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, and that in 2005, and now it's going to trigger flooding in New Orleans because of the dike system, et cetera. New Orleans, much of it's underground, and over almost 1,000 people died, thousands of refugees, and the Bush administration's, their reaction to it was an absolute mess. So President Bush is going to get blamed for this. And even though President Bush's popularity was incredibly high due to the attack and the war, kind of rallying to the president, 2005 his popularity tanked because of Katrina and the disaster of the Iraq War. President Bush will leave office as one of the more unpopular presidents in American history. But then again, Biden would be very unpopular, and then Trump is incredibly unpopular. So it just, I think that's becoming the norm of unpopular presidents. So, bubble. There was a massive stock market speculative bubble that began about 2003, and it was triggered in real estate. Real estate. Can't go into all the details, it's too complex, but a massive speculative bubble formed. And housing prices went up, and beginning in 2007, the real estate bubble began to snap, began to blow, but the rest of the speculative bubble continued. And that is going to blow up into a massive stock market and speculative crash, financial crash happened in 2008. I'm trying to decide how much I should tell you. That's enough. But it started with the real estate bubble. And that is going to lead to the Great Recession. That it's going to go from, it actually started in 2007 before the crash, a little like the Great Depression. So it went from 2007 all the way to 2015. This economic disaster that they didn't want to call it depression, so they called it the Great Recession. And what that meant is, first, there was a massive economic crash, and then long-term credit freeze, debt deflation, and unemployment. That went on year after year after year. So many people lost their homes. It was really awful. And where we at? So the bailout. So right before the election of 2008, Congress passed an almost $1 trillion bailout called TARP, Toxic Asset Recovery Program, just TARP. A massive bailout to bail out the banks, to give the banks money so the banking system does not collapse. Because it looked like the entire financial system of the world might collapse. Worldwide, yeah. Because all the banks are integrated, so it's spread all over. Like one of the worst places was Iceland. It was a disaster. And so the US gave billions of dollars, and we have to have one more bit to the bailout. Then the Federal Reserve Bank gave approximately $15 trillion. Do things like buy all their bad assets, bad bonds, called toxic assets, just giving them money, money, money. And what happened was this. Almost 10 million families lost their homes when the financial closure happened. But who did the US government bail out? The big banks. And there'll be a lot of this resentment. That started with George W. Bush. But then President Obama got this and kept going with bailing out the banks, even though he said he would bail out homeowners. President Obama was not as conservative as George W. Bush or Trump, but economically pretty darn conservative, hoping this applied to the big banks, not regular people. And the stimulus. So in Obama's administration, they would pass a nearly $800 million stimulus bill, the American Recovery Act. And it was going to be about a third were tax cuts to try to stop the free fall in the economy and do building projects. Remember like the WPA from the New Deal? So built a number of things like school had some reconstruction done. That was part of done through that program. And it partially worked. The economy stopped its free fall and began to grow again, but we still had too high an unemployment and a credit freeze. But it wasn't big enough to get the economy going. And so it stopped the free fall. It should have probably been maybe 3 times bigger. I don't know. $2 billion or $2 trillion. I know that's a lot. And President Obama was partially elected by wanting to reform the healthcare system. And in a jumbled mess, our healthcare system was a jumbled mess. And he wanted to reform it, was called the Affordable Care Act. And everybody write down that soon it become known as Obamacare. And it had 2 different parts. Part of it was insurance reform. So make it harder for insurance companies to deny people or provide care, things like that. So, and do things like provide preventative medicine would be covered by insurance. And that has been very successful. The other part was it was going to set up pools to buy insurance for regular people, called it the insurance market, to allow people who did not have insurance from their healthcare or from their job to buy insurance. And that has been less successful, partially because it was so complicated that when President Trump came in, he wanted to get rid of it. Didn't happen. They kind of got rid of some of those reforms. We got this weird system, so that limited success. Okay, it's supposed to say Occupy Wall Street, but I put down Occupy Law Street. And I've had that for a while, and I always think I'm going to change that. And then I forget. So Occupy Wall Street. And this was a real fight about, remember the bailout helping the very wealthy? And even though many of the bankers and financial and some of the financial leaders in the US committed fraud, nobody was ever arrested. Nobody. For what happened. And the anger over this is going to lead to this fight against the wealth inequality and the fact that very wealthy could get off scot-free and get a bailout and got bonuses while they destroyed the world's economy. And for nearly 3 months, thousands of people occupied a park right next to Wall Street and protest to these vast inequalities. And this is going to help trigger kind of a movement. You see that two different types of movements come out of this. A movement to do something about wealth inequality. And then the other one is going to be called the Tea Party. And the Tea Party were more a conservative movement, saying that what caused the problem was all this money going to people who don't deserve it with government programs. Even though the anger was about the money going to banks, they focused a lot of their anger on things like any kind of aid to working people, that sort of thing. And this was a very much a conservative movement within the Republican Party. And so that was the two reactions against, well, we just got to get rid of the government, or we got to use the government to try to get rid of inequality. And the Tea Party would definitely help. And a lot of people who lost their homes are part of this movement. And this will help lead to Trump, without a doubt. President Trump would come out of this. The Roberts Court. So John Roberts was Chief Justice. He'd be appointed by George W. Bush, still the Chief Justice today. And this is probably the most conservative court in American history. And Roberts came in with a number of different goals. So let me tell you, one goal I did not put down there was to get rid of the Voting Rights Act to guarantee voting. That was passed in 1965 to get rid of inequalities in the voting system. And probably this term, they will get rid of it. Roberts has already said racism does no longer exist. And so there's no worry about that anymore. And then two other big court cases are really important. One is called Citizens United. And Citizens United basically said that corporations are people and therefore should have no limits to campaign spending. Oh, you should see what happened. Once that happened, wow, the corporations start giving money and also billions. And the last one is the Heller decision, Heller versus DC, reversing almost 200 years of precedent. The Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment does imply personal ownership of weapons, even though it said it did not for years. It's about militia. It says, even though it says something else, it implies personal ownership, and that would lead to basically very few restrictions on gun ownership today. You want me to do the last two? You notice I stopped in 2016. I know a lot of stuff happened. It's hard to talk about things in the last decade because we really have no perspective. And it's also very hard for me to talk about this kind of stuff because I have very strong personal political views towards these. And I'm trying not to let them all come through, but it's really hard. So I'm trying. Now, they're going to come through. But the election of 2016. So after President Obama was elected for 2 terms, his Secretary of State and former Senator Hillary Clinton, who was also former First Lady, would get the nomination. Actually, really close against an absolutely unknown independent senator from Vermont named Bernie Sanders, who jumped in partially because of the Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street. He's unknown, except for a few people who kind of follow politics. But Hillary Clinton, and she was the Democratic nominee, and shocking everybody, Donald Trump, who had not even, not only been not really political, he had been a Democrat, or at least kind of Democrat. And he became famous by, he actually entered the political fray by attacking President Obama, saying he wasn't really born in the US. And that's what really, he's what's called a birther. And that's what got him fame. And he ran, I don't know, after his television show went under, I mean, it's very interesting why he ran. But no one really expected him to win. But he tapped into the anger and resentment that was going on, partially from the Tea Party. He tapped into something and won the Republican nomination. And every poll had Hillary Clinton winning a big election. And especially when Trump basically was caught on tape talking about sexually assaulting women. And it didn't matter. One of the biggest political upsets in history, President Trump or Donald Trump would be elected president. I think he was more surprised than him, to be true. But he won. And it was quite the upset. And that's where we start getting a real conservative versus liberal divide that's starting to break apart. And you start seeing it more now. Liberal, more and more you might hear the term progressive, even though those terms sometimes don't always work very well. But it's two different types of conservative and liberal. Most people think of it in terms of the culture war. And part of the reason President Trump was able to win is he was able to tap into popular anger against, for example, trans rights or gay rights, or gay marriage was just allowed 13 years earlier. So he tapped into that culture war, rights versus not having rights. But Trump also was very conservative and supply side economics. Two massive tax cuts in his first and then second term. We're more and more liberal. You're starting to see a return to demand side economics. Demand side Keynesian economics. How is that for getting through things very, very quickly? This was actually really hard because I wanted to tell more, but I didn't. Are you proud of me?
We just did this in class. We've had it like a week.
Yeah, no context at all. All right. So if you look at this last page, let me tell you something real quick for then you can do whatever. I might not get to all of this last part, class. If I don't, that means you got to kind of do it. Sound good? All right.
I think I'm missing the last one.
That was a lot. That was a lot. I'm.
Is there an H12?
All right. Hey. So now you guys don't have to worry about it. Good job. I know there's always 1,000 different things going on in here, but during intervention time, I will do